All right, Chapter 13, Part 2. There are only 14 chapters in this book. I think you guys are going to be really interested in Chapter 14, but we need to finish 13. On April 7, 1864, visitors crowded the Senate galleries to overflowing so they could witness what promised to be a historic moment. The upper chamber of Congress was ready at last to vote on the 13th Amendment. When the presiding officer called the roll, 44 members answered present. This meant that 30 aye votes would be needed for the required two-thirds majority of those in their seats. Aye means yes. Slowly, the senators' names were called again. When the counting was done, 38 had voted yes and only 6 no. The measure had soundly passed in the U.S. Senate. Not a single Republican senator voted against the 13th Amendment, and a few Democrats, Maryland's influential Johnson included, crossed the aisle to vote for it. Willard Salisbury of Delaware, who had once called President Lincoln the weakest man ever placed in high office, was among the Democrats who remained bitterly opposed. I now bid farewell to any hope of the reconstruction of the American Union, he angrily declared before the Senate adjourned. Few were surprised by his fury. A year later, Salisbury had launched such a verbal attack against Lincoln so vicious that the Senate sergeant-at-arms approached his seat to remove him forcibly from the floor, at which point the bellicose senator took out a pistol and threatened. But, as political observers noted, the Senate had acted this day without any formal instructions from Lincoln. With the Republican convention only a few more weeks away, the president still wanted to keep his distance from the hot and divisive issue. I claim not to have controlled events, he modestly insisted around this time, but confessed plainly that events have controlled me. Now, at the end of 3 years' struggle, the nation's condition is not what either party or any man devised or expected. God alone can claim it. Whither it is tending seems plain. If God now wills the removal of a great wrong, the wills also that we of the North as well as you of the South shall pay fairly for our complicity in that wrong. Impartial history will find therein new cause to attest and reverse the justice and goodness of God. The president's message could not have been clearer. God had influenced Lincoln, and in return, Lincoln had influenced history. Emancipation and the organization of the U.S. colored troops followed, and now the amendment was next on God's agenda. Lincoln still avoided venturing his own personal opinions about the measure, but he was suggesting his own view did not matter. God wanted it passed. The House of Representatives took up the amendment question on May 31st. Though Lincoln again refrained from stating his personal preference, when his party's convention convened a few days later, he instructed his spokesman to make sure that the keystone in the party's platform supported the constitutional amendment and would abolish and prohibit slavery forever. On June 15th, the House of Representatives got its chance to do exactly that, but failed. The final House vote was 93 for the amendment and 65 against, a majority to be sure, but not enough. It was 13 votes short of the two-thirds needed for passage. 23 members had made sure they were absent for the roll call, and 1 abstained. For now, the measure was dead. Lincoln's hope of keeping the constitutional amendment out of the presidential campaign died, too. The real vote would come, after all, on Election Day. Freedom advocates quickly changed their focus and turned their attention to Lincoln's race for president. Only if he won the re-election would the final nail be hammered into the coffin of slavery. Lincoln struggled to save his presidency. Not everyone in 1864 applauded his sense of justice and humanity. In the darkest days of the heated, ugly campaign, as the Democrats relentlessly hammered away at Lincoln as a friend of integration and race mixing, the president was briefly forced, by some accounts, to consider peace without freedom. The New York Times urged Lincoln to send a delegation to Richmond to offer a peace deal to the Confederacy or face losing the presidency to McClellan, but Lincoln held firm on his promise. He would not now compromise on freedom. Perhaps the most heartening day in the entire campaign came on September 8th when a group from Baltimore calling itself a Committee of Colored Men arrived at the White House to present President Lincoln with the Bible in appreciation of your humane conduct towards the people of our race. The inscription read, "To Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, the friend of universal freedom, from the loyal colored people of Baltimore, as a token of respect and gratitude." Deeply moved, Lincoln could only bring himself to respond. As I have often said before, it has always been a sentiment with me that all mankind should be free. So far as able, I have always acted as I believed to be right and just. Lincoln's huge Election Day victory signified for him that the people accepted and supported emancipation. 1 month later, in December, he used his annual message to Congress to herald the vote as the voice of the people now, for the first time, heard on the question of freedom. May we not agree, the sooner the better, he asked. Unanimity of action among those seeking a common end is desirable. Now he was ready to make the voice of the people heard nationwide. Over the next 5 months, he did all he could, and more than any president before him, to win complete freedom for African Americans. More hope arrived that fall as well. In mid-October, Chief Justice Taney died at the age of 87 after serving decades on the Supreme Court and years fighting the black man's claim to freedom and equality. Lincoln waited until after his re-election to propose a successor, but when he announced his choice on December 6, many Americans expressed surprise. Lincoln chose a man for whom he had no personal affection, someone who had treated him with selfishness and disloyalty. His selection was none other than former Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, who just a few months earlier had shamelessly tried to replace Lincoln as the Republican candidate for president. Despite their adversary relationship, Lincoln knew he could trust Chase to vote to uphold emancipation if its legality ever came before the Supreme Court. Chase was no friend of Lincoln, but he was a friend of black freedom, and that was enough for the remarkably selfless president. Once he announced the Chase appointment, Lincoln turned back to the major challenge at hand, a new vote in the House of Representatives on the 13th Amendment. Many wondered then, and some have wondered since, why Lincoln did not simply wait until next Congress convened in Washington the following year before reinstituting his campaign for the amendment. After all, if he had allowed newly chosen House and Senate members to take their seats, both chambers would have been overwhelmingly Republican, and the amendment would have easily won support of the two-thirds needed. The amendment would easily have won the next two-thirds test in the next House of Representatives, where the effort had fallen 13 short during the June vote. The president could have called his new Congress into session right after his next inauguration, in March 1865, or he might have waited until the summer for another dramatic July 4th session like the one 4 years earlier, at which he had defended his power to fight the rebellion. Independence Day 1865 would have been a perfect symbolic moment to extend independence to the millions who had been denied it in the 89 years since the founding of the country. Instead, the president decided to push the amendment as soon as possible through the same House of Representatives that had previously voted not to support it. For one thing, he reasoned that prompter passage would not only liberate people sooner, but could also save the lives of soldiers and reunite the country more quickly. Every day the war continued, hundreds, even thousands more died fighting for the Union cause. Every day that slavery remained legal, millions remained in chains, subject to forced labor and inhumane cruelty. I'm going to stop there for today. That was part 2.